Yo, Jordan, this right here is crazy. I feel big, you know? Like not big in the sense of weight, you know what I mean? Like gaining weight or nothing like that, like colossal, like, you know what I mean? Like, I heard you were looking for me. Hello. You know.
Explosions. Big messes of metal. Electrical orgies. When there's this much mindless spectacle, does it matter if there's any story to go with it? Or could movies with big robots be more than what they've always been? I'm Evan Wessman, and this is an interior analysis of the big robots trend.
Okay, we're going with giant robots again. All right, real original, guys. I'm not impressed. I am not impressed.
This is a pretty simple trend to define. If there's big-ass robots that are having big-ass action scenes as a central hook of the movie, it's in this trend. So, the movies I'll be looking at are all of the Transformers movies, including Bumblebee, Real Steel, Battleship, Pacific Rim, and Pacific Rim Uprising. If you care about spoilers, this is your warning. These movies are pretty light on spoilers, so I don't think that should deter you, but I haven't bothered trying to make this spoiler-proof.
In this farewell, there's no blood, there's no alibi, 'cause I've drawn regret.
The trend, of course, starts with the first Transformers movie in 2007. The first four movies are all massive hits financially, if not so much critically. The fifth is by far the worst performing financially, but still turned a pretty decent profit. I'm not going to spend time on the individual installments for a couple reasons. The first reason is that they're all similar enough to each other that they can kind of be talked about as a unit. The second reason is that Lindsay Ellis has pretty much closed the book on unpacking the Michael Bay directed Transformers movies with her whole plate videos.
I ate the whole plate. The whole plate.
If you're watching this and you don't know Lindsay Ellis, let's be real, you're probably one of my family members. But if you're into this kind of video essay and you somehow haven't heard of her yet, you should absolutely check out her channel after this video. Michael Bay infuses these movies with all of his signature things: chaotic action visuals, explosions, cringe and offensive sense of humor, objectification of women, and glorification of the US military. These movies have been the butt of a lot of jokes over the years, and I have definitely piled onto those because they absolutely deserve the criticism they get. But I have to admit, when I was 12, I thought they were awesome. And to give them some credit, most of the visual effects still look good today. There's something really satisfying about watching the transformations. The action usually gets too chaotic to follow, but there's still a craft to it. I'm not the first to say this, but for all of the well-deserved gripes with Michael Bay and his movies, it's not easy to do what he does as well as he does it. The first Transformers movie set the precedent that if a movie has big robots and massive action scenes that look cool, it doesn't need much else to make a massive amount of money. Because everything else in these movies is pretty bad. The story for each one ranges from barely passable to so bad that I don't think I could write a script so messy even if I actively tried to. I'm pretty sure the lore and the series continuity also ends up contradicting itself at a few points. Basically every human character in these movies is some combination of insufferably annoying, a stoic soldier, an objectified woman, or a gross racial stereotype. And actually, come to think of it, most of the robots fall into those categories too. There are rare moments where these movies pretend to have some kind of emotional core, but it rings so hollow that it makes Vin Diesel saying family seem downright earnest by comparison. So, there's not much to these movies in terms of substance, but obviously other studios wanted to replicate its massive success. In 2011, the same year as the third and most profitable Transformers movie, we got Real Steel. The robots in this movie are used as cage fighters in place of human boxers. They're the smallest robots across all these movies and aren't sentient like the Transformers, but instead are remote controlled by humans during the fights. Hugh Jackman stars as a former boxer who now tries and fails to make a living manning these robots in fights. Of all the movies in this trend, this one is probably tied with Bumblebee for making the strongest attempt at having an emotional core. And for my money, I'd give it about a C on that. There's a very Spielberg-esque story of Hugh Jackman connecting with his long-lost son as the two of them train a fighting bot together. This kid is insufferable, though. Like, I'm pretty sure they just cryo-froze young Anakin from Phantom Menace for 10 years and then woke him up for this movie. Despite that, Hugh Jackman gives a good enough performance to almost sell me on this relationship. But outside of my own enjoyment, I'd say the story is derivative but functional, which is more than you can say for any of the Transformers movies. There's less spectacle to the robots fighting this time, but since the fights are staged for human entertainment, there's still a lot of attention and time set aside for them, and they serve as pretty decent boxing fights, so even if it's less to my taste, I can't deny that it delivers on the spectacle element, and it even does a good job of adding some character beats into the fight scenes. In 2012, we got the most blatant imitator of Transformers with Battleship. In this case, the big robots are the villains in the form of a massive alien spaceship that the US Navy has to fight. We never get any clarity on their intentions, except that they want to send a transmission back to their home planet. There are some shots from the aliens' POV where they seem to be trying to only target weapons and avoid human casualties where they can. It feels like maybe there was an earlier draft of the script that established their goals and the rules that they play by, and this is just the confusing leftovers. In terms of adapting the board game, there's just one scene that has the grid system with people calling out coordinates to try and hit the alien ships as they move around. And it actually might be the best scene in the movie. But the main thing that this movie seems to be here to do is be a recruitment tool for the Navy. Nearly every character aside from the aliens is connected to the military in some way. When the aliens arrive, they put up a force field so that the only defense inside to fight them are 3 US Navy destroyers. The climax features a bunch of real-life Navy veterans helping the main characters rehabilitate the USS Missouri battleship to save the day. Even the casting of Rihanna feels like it's for recruitment purposes.
Mahalo, motherfucker.
Military propaganda in movies tends to get criticized by those in my circles, and I agree with those criticisms, both in terms of this movie and others. But at least in this case, it doesn't become explicitly jingoistic or xenophobic. Nearly every aspect of this movie is emulating Transformers, from the glorification of the military, to the design of the alien robots, to the Bayhem-inspired cinematography, to the casting of supermodels, to the Hasbro property adaptation. For both better and worse, this movie is lacking some key Michael Bay elements. On the plus side, Battleship is a lot more respectful of its characters, and doesn't devolve into offensive stereotype-based humor. But on the downside, the action is pretty bland, which, coupled with a lacking story, gives this movie little to offer. Ultimately, it was both a financial and critical flop. In terms of its budget to gross earnings ratio, it's actually the least successful movie of this trend, with the 3rd highest budget and the 2nd lowest opening. So needless to say, it wasn't the hit that Universal clearly hoped it would be. In 2013, we got Pacific Rim. This movie has the biggest robots, which are made with the sole purpose of fighting off massive kaiju that come from a wormhole in the ocean. The robots, which are called Jaegers, are piloted by 2 humans that have to pass each other's vibe check in order to pilot it. The term they use is drift compatible, and it's a cool concept on paper that the movie explores a little, though not as much as I wish it did. Personally, I find myself less engaged by the action in this than the others. I think maybe because the monsters and robots move slowly. But I have to admit that this movie basically works. The story's passable enough, and there's plenty of time spent on the big robot kaiju fights. And the cinematography does a really good job of making you feel the scale of the robots. The human characters aren't anything special, but they have just enough texture and depth to them that they aren't distractingly generic or devolve into stereotypes. Although it definitely would have helped if they had cast someone with more charisma than Charlie Hunnam in the lead role. I've heard from a couple of friends that there's actually a ton of extended lore that's been created for this world, and I think that care in the world building shines through in subtle ways. The story is kept pretty simple, but there are hints of deeper aspects of this world that make it feel lived in. So even though I'm not really a fan of it, I can understand why it's garnered a passionate fan base. Within the text of the movie, the world building stays pretty focused, in the sense that each element is given the right amount of attention, and doesn't leave any loose ends or strange things to distract the audience. But there's enough to give a sense of the world without confusing the casual audience and pique the interest of those who want to dig deeper. Despite being an original property, it did pretty well financially, especially overseas, and garnered decent audience ratings. But the same can't be said for the sequel. the sequel to Pacific Rim is a pretty underwhelming outing for this trend. It doesn't really go bigger than the first movie, and feels like it isn't made with the same love and ambition. It has the same basic premise of kaiju fighting Jaegers, and evolves that premise a little by having the kaiju in the climax bond together to create a mega kaiju, and a couple fights where the Jaegers fight other Jaegers that are being controlled by a kaiju's brain. There's also a small element of people looting fallen Jaegers to create smaller unauthorized ones. But for everything I've heard about the cool lore of this world, the sequel doesn't seem to be exploring it at all. The main thing that I think drags this movie down is the amount of half-baked human characters that are included. There's a few scenes that try to get us invested in them, but they all fall pretty flat. I think it might have been possible to give the audience some kind of emotional investment if they'd reduced the number of characters, or at least limited the focus to just John Boyega and Kaylee Spaney. As it is, the movie spreads itself thin by introducing a bunch of new characters that it wants us to care about, but then not doing enough work to actually make us care. Obviously, since this trend originated from a line of toys, there's an element of merchandising that is present in all of these movies. But this one feels the most like it was made to sell toys. The kaiju bonding at the end feels like it's perfectly suited to be a Happy Meal toy tie-in, where you have to get all 3 kaiju toys and then you can combine them into one big one, and the new Jaegers even somehow feel more like toys than the ones from the first movie. Bumblebee is set in the 80s, and on paper acts as a prequel to the Transformers series, but in practice is more of a retcon. It's the first Transformers movie that Michael Bay didn't direct, and you can really feel that. The story is almost like if the first Transformers movie had made Megan Fox's character the protagonist, and made Shia LaBeouf an adorable nerd instead of an insufferable asshole. The tone is much more wholesome in a way that seems to be setting up 80s family movies like E.T. The military is actually a force of antagonism here, although they aren't necessarily the outright villains. Personally, I found it to be pretty derivative and generic, but I must admit that this story does the work to invest you in these characters. And it limits the characters it wants the audience to focus on, which I think goes a long way. For better or worse, it's probably the lightest on action out of all these movies. And the action is fine. It's at least coherent, but I can't say that I enjoyed it. Perhaps the most important thing it did for this trend is hit the reset button on the Transformers franchise, and make way for...
On my soul, everybody in the click strap, and they all on gold. Keep a stick just like Branch Poppy, but I ain't a troll. On my mama, can't nobody out here play.
Transformers Rise of the Beast is set in 1994 and has just enough allusion to the events of Bumblebee to make them canonically part of the same timeline. In terms of continuity, it feels like this movie and Bumblebee are kind of trying to do what X-Men First Class and Days of Future Past did, and reset the franchise so they can ignore the Bay movies without completely disavowing them. The story is pretty basic, but it's at least functional and coherent. It doesn't put as much focus on an emotional story as Bumblebee, but it has a small arc of Anthony Ramos and Optimus Prime building trust with each other that actually pays off surprisingly well. We get somewhat of a return to the bombastic action of the previous movies. It's much more coherent than the Bayhem of the prior entries, and takes on a visual aesthetic that's more similar to Phase 3 Marvel movies. A few moments of this are pretty fun in terms of action, but they seem to be restrained by something. There are a lot of shots that feel like they're gearing up to be awesome long takes, but then cut out just as things start getting good. For once, we actually have significantly more robot characters than humans. The only humans really are Anthony Ramos, his little brother, and Dominique Fishback. The military is absent in this one, although it's mentioned that Anthony Ramos was kicked out of the army for vague reasons, and that never becomes important anyway. For the most part, it feels like this movie is the franchise trying to take after the MCU with its formulaic and safe story choices, abandonment of cringe humor from the Bay entries, and of course the ending scene crossover tease. I remember when David first told me about this crossover, I was just like, okay, now movies are literally just a kid playing with all his toys. So what can we see when we zoom out on this trend? For starters, I think a major reason there aren't many movies in it is that it's very expensive to make them. Real Steel has the lowest budget of all of these at $110 million, which is obviously not cheap. And Battleship proved that even being based on a well-known property isn't enough to be financially lucrative. Pacific Rim found success as an original movie, but even with Guillermo del Toro directing, it was a pretty big financial gamble that I'm sure most studios would be hesitant to take. And Uprising was ultimately a bit of a disappointment financially. So it makes sense that, despite their reputation, Transformers is the only part of this trend that has proven itself to work with any consistency. But a question I want to examine here is, what do we want from these movies? If I got assigned to write one of them, I might be tempted to take more of the Real Steel or Bumblebee approach that focuses more on the characters. But as an audience member, I don't want that. I watch these movies to see big robots blow things up and smash stuff, and if the director, cinematographer, editor, and visual effects team can make that look cool, that's really enough. It's expensive, gaudy, low art, but there's a place for that. One night last year, I got home exhausted and brain dead after working a double food running shift at a restaurant. I opened up Netflix, clicked on Transformers 3, skipped forward to the final battle in Chicago, and just turned my brain off as 45 minutes of non-stop explosions played out in front of me. And right then, that really hit the spot. 3.5 out of 5-star experience, would recommend. First 2 hours, not so much. But I acknowledge that fans of this genre may at least want decent stories to go with the fun action scenes. And these movies are definitely easier to enjoy when the story is more competently told. Maybe some of you are happy with these movies in both an action and story sense. But I personally don't think any of these individual movies deliver both a serviceable story and exciting action. There's 3 factors that I think contribute to this that I want to examine. The human problem, the theme problem, and the Bay problem.
2 hearts, 2 souls, one mind.
I often think about something that my co-host Jelani says about movies like this, where the main draw is something supernatural or at least non-human.
I don't think anybody in the history of watching any of these movies has ever said, "Man, I like this movie, but I wish they had more humans."
I think studios call for more human characters in these movies because they think it makes them more accessible and have broader appeal. And there might be a truth to that, but the way these movies are marketed kind of suggests otherwise. Look at these posters. The actors are not what's being highlighted here. Some of these movies have huge casts that are barely featured in the marketing. The Pacific Rim posters don't have a single human in them. The human faces are barely even visible on these Transformers posters because they're just there to give scale to the robots. The marketing teams know that the cast and characters are not what will draw audiences in. Just to drive it home, here's a list of actors who are in these movies, and here's how many of their names appear in the posters and trailers. Now, I acknowledge that there have to be at least some humans in these movies, but they seem to really struggle to find the right balance of incorporating the human characters. Last year we did a series of episodes for the podcast on horror movies, and at the end of it, one of our takeaways was that in a horror context, it often takes twice as much work to get an audience invested in your characters. But in some cases, it can also be effective to oversimplify your characters so that they can just be cannon fodder. I think a place these movies fall short is when they land in the middle of that spectrum. The worst parts of the Michael Bay Transformers movies are the ones that focus on the humans. Pacific Rim Uprising drags a lot because of how many characters they spend time half developing. Real Steel and Bumblebee do put in the work to invest us in their lead characters, and it works well enough, but I can't say that I personally had any kind of attachment to them. Rise of the Beast seems to strike a good balance by reducing the number of humans and giving them just enough to invest us, but not too much that they take attention away from the Transformers or drag the plot down. Pacific Rim 1 also does a pretty good job of keeping its cast of characters small and simple enough that they can carry us through the story, so hopefully that kind of approach continues moving forward. I think casting plays an important role here too. No actor is ever going to win an Oscar for their performance in one of these movies, but screen presence from the human actors can count for a lot. Idris Elba, Haley Steinfeld, Anthony Ramos, Hugh Jackman, and Charlie Day all bring a charisma to their roles here that can keep us interested in a way that someone like Charlie Hunnam, Taylor Kitsch, or even Mark Wahlberg don't. So for later installments, I think keeping the human characters simple and not including too many of them will be a key to success. These movies tend to fall into a trap that I talked about in my video on the Kingsman movies, half-assing a theme. Theme and genre are often related to each other in the sense that certain genres lend themselves well to exploring certain themes. There's 2 themes that these movies tend to gravitate towards. One is finding connection in unlikely places, which Bumblebee and Real Steel do, and Rise of the Beast kinda does. The other is basically just a pro-military sentiment, which most of the other movies do to different degrees. The Bay Transformers movies are notorious for how much they glorify the US military. Battleship, as I mentioned, is basically a 2-hour recruitment video for the Navy. The Pacific Rim movies don't feature a specific military force, but both movies have a pro-military ethos in how they portray the Jaegers and general military might as the only defense against the invading kaiju. I'm showing some of my own politics here, but I'm glad that this trend has moved away from jingoistic military propaganda. Anyone else think jingoism sounds like a slur? I don't know, I always feel like it sounds like a slur. When these movies don't focus on militaristic themes, they basically end up being a remix of The Iron Giant. And that approach at least makes for more wholesome messaging, but it still presents some problems. Bumblebee kind of does the Iron Giant thing where the robot develops a friendship with the human because the human sees them as more than just a weapon. But the problem there is that the main appeal of this genre is to watch big robots fight each other. So if you take the approach of showing the robot as peaceful, it's kind of antithetical to then have the climax be the robot blowing stuff up. In fairness, the movie doesn't seem to be trying to portray Bumblebee as a pacifist necessarily. Real Steel solved this problem more cleanly by having the robot not really be a person, and instead serve as a way for Hugh Jackman to connect with his son. And the whole plot of the movie is about making the robot better at fighting, so at every turn it's acknowledging the fact that the robot is there to beat up other robots, and not trying to invest the audience in the robot as an actual character. I was pretty surprised at how well Rise of the Beasts handled its theme. Without restating everything I said in the Kingsman video, I like that Rise of the Beasts keeps things simple with its theme. Basically, it's just Anthony Ramos and Optimus Prime learning to work together, but this line that they repeat a few times is a good, simple theme.
Till all are one.
And this scene where they finally see eye to eye works pretty well.
You were looking out for your own. I can't even be angry at you for that.
On my home world, we believe that the battle with darkness will continue till all are one. I lost sight of that. You fought for yours as I fought for mine, when we should have been fighting the darkness together.
Well, I ain't done fighting yet.
Maybe I'm being generous with my reading here, but it feels like it's kind of saying that fighting an oppressive system can benefit everyone who's oppressed by them. It's simple, but it works in context of the movie, and it's a more progressive message than I ever thought we would see in a Transformers movie. So with all of that being said, how should these movies deal with theme? Well, my answer is that maybe they shouldn't. Without getting into the moral panic that sometimes comes up about the impacts of violence in media, let's just acknowledge the fact that audiences enjoy violence on some level. We love action movies, they're awesome. And the main appeal of these movies taps into our love for seeing shit blow up and massive creatures throw hands with each other. So given that, I just prefer if these movies didn't portray violence and militarism as morally good. I've said this before, but I like that even though John Wick is obviously the protagonist of his movies, that series never tries to convince us that he's necessarily a good guy or is serving some higher moral purpose when he's headshotting 200 henchmen. But when we see Optimus Prime rip off a Decepticon's face and then say some fake deep shit about honor, it has kind of a gross implication. Personally, I don't want more reheated leftovers of the Iron Giant story for future movies, but I acknowledge that it is a viable route for these movies to take. And if they can continue to do what Rise of the Beasts did, and successfully half-ass theme, I'm here for that. Maybe one of these movies will surprise me and have a really excellent theme. In their best form, I'd like to think that one of them can follow in the footsteps of Mad Max Fury Road and have insane action while also exploring a theme really well. But until that time, I'd prefer if they just leave theme aside and embrace being dumb fun. At the very least, I don't think they should make attempts at theme out of a sense of obligation. When I say all this, I'm not suggesting that movies shouldn't have good characters or themes. All the best movies have those. But these aren't the best movies. They're popcorn entertainment. And, as I said, there's a place for that. Sometimes we just want to watch something dumb and expensive that requires minimal effort to enjoy or engage with. But just because they're dumb doesn't mean they can't be made with creativity and integrity. Which brings us to... I tried so hard and got so far, but in the end... Stylistically, I think Michael Bay might be one of the best directors for this kind of movie. I go watch action scenes from the first 3 Transformers movies occasionally because they look cool in their own way. But he fills the rest of those movies with annoying characters, mean-spirited jokes, misogyny, and general cringe to the point that I never want to rewatch those movies in their entirety. I've mentioned a few times that I wish the other movies in this trend had a little bit more bayhem in their action scenes, because I find a lot of them to be disappointingly generic. On the other hand, their tones and plots at least aren't actively bad in the way that the first 5 Transformers movies are. So the question becomes, can we have the bayhem without the bay? Can these movies have the chaotic fun action of the final act of Dark of the Moon, while also being narratively cohesive and not disgustingly toxic? In theory, I'd like to say that they can. There's really no reason that one movie can't check all of those boxes. But for my money, none of them have. Rise of the Beasts and Pacific Rim 1 probably come the closest, but I think the ceiling is higher than that. An obvious solution would be to just let Michael Bay direct all the action scenes and have zero involvement beyond that. But he's so over these movies that I don't think that's likely to happen. And as much as I've said that I have a guilty enjoyment of his action style, Transformers 4 and 5 are not fun for me in the same way that some of the action scenes from the first 3 are. Maybe Michael Bay himself never cared about these movies, but somebody cared enough to at least make some sick action scenes in the first 3. But nobody cared enough about The Last Night to make it even remotely good in any way. So we're probably all better off if Michael Bay stays away from these movies. But I wonder if maybe some other director can bring a level of craft to these huge-scale action scenes that brings them to their full potential. I think Matthew Vaughn might be able to do that, but I get the sense that he doesn't have an interest in this kind of movie. Tommy Wirkola, who made Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters and Violent Night, also feels like he could maybe pull that off, but who knows if he'll get the chance. To his credit, Stephen Capale Jr. and his team made some pretty fun and cool moments in Rise of the Beasts, so maybe with some more creative freedom and vision, the later movies could set the bar for this trend higher than where it's at now. Before I get into the conclusion, I just want to make a quick clarification. I've been somewhat critical of the portrayal of the military in these movies throughout this video, and I just want to make it clear that I'm not trying to speak ill of individual people who have served in the military. What I'm taking issue with here is how several of these movies portray military might uncritically. It's a criticism of how studios partner with the US military to make some of their biggest movies act as pro-military propaganda. Despite having grown up in a Navy family, I don't have a terribly high opinion of the military as an institution, and I've tried not to let that influence too much of my analysis here. But I've also personally met a lot of people who have served in both the American military and foreign militaries, as well as their families. And I know them to be good people, so I don't want what I've said here to be misinterpreted as any kind of slight against them. My critique is of the institution, not the individuals. Now let's get to the conclusion. Despite everything that I've said, I also want to acknowledge that some fans of this trend might already be getting what they want out of it. A lot of people seem to get more emotionally invested in Bumblebee than I did, and as I said, Pacific Rim has a fairly passionate fan base. So I should set aside my own preferences and embrace the fact that this trend truly does have more to offer than just dumb fun. And even though the more recent movies haven't been the billion-dollar successes that the early Transformers movies were, this trend has continued in spite of, and quite possibly because of, some genuinely positive changes. I doubt that there will be any more original big robot movies, but I wouldn't be surprised if we got a third Pacific Rim movie, and we're almost definitely going to get more Transformers. So given that, I think it's fitting to end this video like all of the Transformers movies, with a self-important voiceover monologue set to a Linkin Park song.
This is a message to Paramount Studios. You have done well to rid your most profitable franchise of its worst elements. You even seem to have refused to continue being propaganda vehicles for the United States military. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. But never forget what these movies are. They are dumb. They are loud. They are fun. They are not well suited to deep themes. And they are never better with more half-baked human characters. But they can still be great for what they are.
I'll face myself to cry.
So, that went some places that I wasn't expecting. I hope my Optimus Prime impression there at the end was decent. I've never really tried doing it before. Once again, I didn't love these movies, but this was an interesting video to make. And if you liked this, I've already done another video just like it covering the gritty fairy tale movie trend, and there's plenty of other video essays and podcasts that you can check out on this channel. We also have a Discord server that you can join for free, and a Patreon that you can join for $1 a month, and get access to things like our watch-along of Transformers Revenge of the Fallen that we did recently, where we talk about Waffle House for a little bit. Don't remember why, but I know that happened. I've got more trend videos like this in the works, so let me know what trends that you want me to cover and what movies I should talk about in them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.